So this is something new for our JewishCommunity.org. I had mentioned this over the summer that we're going to be having individuals joining us to share in services. And I asked Sarah Weiss, who I've known for many years, to join us for several reasons. Congregation Beth Adam, in its Sunday morning adult education series, is bringing in a speaker, our first speaker for this year, whose name is Steen Metz. He's a Holocaust survivor. And the Center for Holocaust and Humanity Education, of which Sarah is the executive director, is our community partner. And one of the things that I wanted to do was to bring our community partners to share with you, those of you who join us online, about aspects of the Cincinnati Jewish community. We have a lot going on here. We have a lot of talented people, a lot of professionals. And I thought it would be important to do that generally and more specifically because we're bringing Steen Metz in. And in about 3 weeks, we will have a short video of him online, an interview with him. Sarah will be conducting the interview. I thought it would be important to share with you about the Center for Holocaust and Humanity Education and let Sarah talk about that. And the first question I had was, I've seen a lot of Holocaust centers, Holocaust museums, and I think the Cincinnati one is unique even in its title. Can you just talk about how that title came about?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. Shabbat Shalom. The Center for Holocaust and Humanity Education is similar in that it was really the brainchild of Holocaust survivors who relocated to Cincinnati and educators and many others. It's different in that when the survivors came together, even in as early as the 1960s here in Cincinnati, the survivors talked about creating something not only to remember the past, but to ensure that we would learn from it. We pulled from their meeting minutes in the 1960s of talking about this idea of not only preserving memory and history, but we want something that really stirs emotion so people can respond today.
Wow.
Which is really unique about our center.
I had no idea.
Yeah.
I mean, and I've been to it many times. I had no idea it came out of that.
It came out of that, and really the idea of our work is about preserving and teaching, and the central part of our work is the history and the lessons, the memory of the Holocaust, but really equally important to that is how do we apply those lessons to today in the world we live in. And when we are working with students or teachers or a variety of groups, we're thinking about ways in which they can turn those lessons into action to address the issues of our day.
So can you give me an example of some of the, because I think most of us, at least I know, how a lot of museums sort of remember the past. How does the center sort of transfer memory into action or memory into a lesson about what do we need to do?
So in a couple of ways. Some of it is just by talking about it. Some of it is talking simply to students and asking them what connections they see. What are they going to do? How can they apply this? Of really making those connections when we talk about rescue during the Holocaust. We ask the question of who are modern day rescuers? How do we see that manifest itself today? And how can you act in a way, you're not going to have somebody knock on your door in the middle of the night asking for a safe haven, but how can you act as a rescuer? So some of these questions of how do we act in the world today, again, just inspire us to think about that broader aspect of our mission and that humanity education.
Right.
Also talking about injustice, genocide of other groups as well. We focus on the Holocaust and on the Jewish experience, but we're really broader and looking at the genocides that have happened, unfortunately, many of them since the Holocaust, what's happening today in Syria and other parts of the world. So it's really just broadening our focus and we also have programs like leadership programs that actually take students, middle school and high school students, and help them build the tools they need to make a difference in their schools and their communities. And that's not actually even Holocaust related. All these kids have learned about the Holocaust and we draw connections, but then we really talk to them about what are the issues they see and what do they want to do and help them build plans to do that. So.
Wow. So I have a lot of questions. I have some written down and some that's coming out, and maybe some folks online. I'll try to take a look when I can. So the reason this also came about for us and for tonight is that we're bringing in a survivor to speak. just talk about the importance of, and he was a child, because, I mean, the reality is many of the survivors who were adults have now died.
Right.
And so what's happening is it's sort of moving down in age. What's the importance of that, and why did the center support us in doing that? And what's the role of having survivors speak, and why is that so important, particularly as I think you've talked about it here, actually, the transition that's sort of is slowly watching happen?
Yeah, we've been talking about it for many years, the past decade or more that I've been in this work of this transition that is happening where living memory is actually being transferred simply into history in a textbook, right? And we're watching that happen. And, there is nothing like the power of a personal story. And I think in relation to many topics, story, narrative is so important. And in particular, every survivor you meet, and I know you've met many, many over the years, the ways in which they were able to survive and able to overcome, and if they were able to rebuild their lives, not everybody was, but those who were, is amazing.
Right.
And so those stories also have the power to inspire teachers, students. Just here in our community, we only have about 10 Holocaust survivors who are still speaking. We have about 100 and so survivors still living. About 10 of them are speaking.
Really?
They speak every year to 15,000 students.
Wow.
It is the most requested, the most impactful service really we can offer. And so we know that, sadly, of course, in 5 or so years, we probably won't have that.
Right. That's interesting, because I know some personal family friends
Right.
who are survivors in the Detroit area, and they didn't talk about it for
Right.
very long time in their lives, and then they decided to start talking about it.
Right.
They would only talk to kids. They said, that's what we need to do. Now, what we're doing here at Congregation Beth Adam, this is an open program for the community. Those of you who live in the area should join us. We're having our 6th grade and above all come. And I talked to the kids about it, that we're going to be links in history.
Yeah.
Because it's not, they read it as history, but they're going to meet somebody and hear somebody. And I said, soon this generation of survivors will no longer exist. They'll be dead.
Right.
And you, as a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old, you're going to sit in college somewhere, and you're going to have someone say to you, oh, it never happened. And you're going to be the witness. You're going to say, no, I've talked to somebody, I've met somebody, I've heard it. And I said, and when you're 50 and you're teaching, and you have a 13-year-old for whom this is 100 years later, you're going to be this link. And the kids just sort of looked with wonder. They didn't think of themselves as being significant components in transmittal of history. So that's, for us, is really important. I'm delighted this came up. This happened as a member, as a friend he's a member of the congregation. This was a personal friend. He doesn't live in the area.
Yeah. Elie Wiesel has something. He says that, to listen to a witness is to become a witness. And that really is what happens, and we are the last generation who will hear these stories firsthand.
How do you think that's going to change? Because you gave a talk here about 2 or 3 years ago, I recall, about the last and it's such a strange notion. Since you gave that talk, I keep on pondering, what does it mean that there are no more witnesses to that atrocity? Certainly there have been atrocities since. How does that change perhaps Jewish identity? Teaching. Yeah,
it's hard to know exactly how it will impact. What I'm most focused on is how it will impact education, and I think it will be devastating on many levels. And on the other hand, there's a lot of resource that the survivors have left us. Right, no other time period like the Holocaust has been so documented by the eyewitnesses. We have video, we have primary sources, which we're fortunate for. It doesn't replace the survivors.
Right.
There's some very unique initiatives going on, like in the Spielberg Foundation is creating holograms of survivors, where survivors become holograms, and they are programmed with 1,000 questions. So students can...
Where's this taking?
Well, actually, the Holocaust Museum in Chicago is a test site for it, and also LA. So the students can ask the survivor who's no longer living almost any question, and they'll answer. Now, I actually struggled with this as thinking this is kind of odd. Are you trying to, bring them back to life? But what they're finding is that for students, they're so used to technology and to interacting with things that it's totally normal.
Right,
to
it's
them.
not right. That's it.
And
right.
it
Wow.
is, it's not replacing that.
Sure.
Personal face-to-face, but it's still a very powerful
Wow,
experience.
that's extraordinary.
So-
I actually heard about this in another situation where holograms are being used, and it sounds fantastic, as in, wow, that's bizarre.
Yeah.
Fantastic is really, we can do that.
Yeah.
But when you think about it, how do you capture memory? How do you keep it alive, and how do you transmit it, and how education? Because I think that's one of the challenges all of us who are educators are always dealing with as our kids change, because they're interacting with technology differently. How do we educate differently, that we connect with them?
Right.
On one level, the kids today have access to world information. They can get anything. You jump on Google, you can type in anything in an instant on your phone.
Right.
I mean, you walk with a kid and you ask a question and they don't know the answer, they just type it in.
Right.
But how do you get them to be engaged with the information, understand the information, feel the information? That's extraordinary. That's great. That's really remarkable. Do you think Holocaust denying is going up? I know, I can't think of his name now. It just escaped. I just read the article today. Famous Holocaust.
David Irving?
Irving.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I got David. I couldn't
Yeah.
remember the last
Yeah.
name.
Yeah.
And he led a tour of, bizarrely, to Holocaust sites in which he basically he took people to them and used it as a forum to deny again.
Yeah.
And I wonder, as we move closer to a time when there are no more survivors alive, if Holocaust denial becomes a more common phenomena, or or is sort of drifting out of vogue because it doesn't have the power that it used to have, because the Holocaust in relation to everything has changed.
Right. I mean, I think it depends. I think there's Holocaust denial is used in different ways, and
Right.
there's different aspects of it. I mean, I think, sadly, the largest growth in Holocaust denial, unfortunately, has been in the Middle East
Right.
and in the Arab world. Here in the U.S., there's a very small percentage of people who truly deny the Holocaust. Those who deny the Holocaust are clearly anti-Semitic,
Right.
as we know. It's just really another form of anti-Semitism. I think, unfortunately, I think it may rise a bit, although I don't think it's so trendy. I think there's so much awareness for the most part. But that being said, when you don't have witnesses here to speak up or to sort of respond, I'm not sure. We know locally we have a Holocaust denier who's attended our events
Really?
and
I didn't know that.
written about some of our local survivors, interrupted different things we've done. So it's here. It's everywhere.
Right.
And it will, I'm sure, continue. There's stories of teachers giving students assignments actually to prove the Holocaust happened. So,
Right.
some of it is naivete and some of it is anti-Semitism and hateful.
Right. Wow. So is the Holocaust a Jewish event, or is it this was a conversation,
Yeah.
we were talking about this, and this is kind of a question, I do a lot of speaking in the community, and if it doesn't come up all the time, depending, but this always becomes a sort of an interesting element for the Jewish community. Clearly it's close to our hearts. 6
Right.
million Jews were killed, but 5 million other innocents were murdered as well. And it's part of our culture. I think it's part of our identity to some degree. It
Right.
certainly casts a shadow
Right.
over the Jewish community. It's part we at our congregation, while we don't talk about it during the high holidays when we read from the Torah, we have a Holocaust Torah. It was
Right.
part of the Czech. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, when the Nazis came into Czechoslovakia, they stole all the Judaica, Torahs, candlesticks. They moved them all to Prague, to the Jewish museum that actually pre-existed the Nazis. After the war, all that was in warehouses. Actually, much of it still is. When I was in Prague, I was talking to people about it. A lot of it's still there.
Right.
But the Torahs got to London about 1600. So we have a Holocaust Torah. And at every bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, our kids read from it. And we talk about that link,
Right.
the Holocaust. But I wonder is it bigger than that? When you teach it, because you're not just teaching Jewish kids or just Jewish audiences, how do you talk about the Holocaust in relationship to Jewish identity and world history and world identity?
So again, we focus on sort of the central Jewish narrative because the Jewish story, the Jewish history as it relates to the Holocaust is very particular. That being said, we really broaden it and talk about the universal aspects of the Holocaust, the non-Jewish victims, which were really unknown or unheard. People would say, oh, we knew there were homosexuals or Roma and Sinti gypsies or people with disabilities, but it's really only in the last 20 years or so that research has really been done on those experiences. And, we work with a professor who does a lot with us. He's actually in Chicago, who talks about common graves. And he says, while the stories are different, Jewish and non-Jewish victims share common graves. And therefore, we have to weave the history together and give voice to victims who had other stories. In addition to that, I think the Holocaust belongs to all of humanity. I feel very strongly, I think that for the Jewish community, the Holocaust, certainly the memory holds a special place in our identity and in our conscience. And, we carry out sort of some of the things we do, I think, because we hold on to that memory and we think about never again and not letting things happen and, reacting. But it was a human catastrophe. It was carried out primarily, as we know, by non-Jewish individuals, and it belongs to all of us. And even Holocaust education and memory, I believe, belongs to all of us. So this summer, our center did a very small but unique exchange program. We brought teachers who teach the Holocaust here in Cincinnati and teachers who teach the Holocaust in Israel.
Right.
And they went to Poland and Israel together. And they started together in Cincinnati. And one of the Israeli teachers said, I started this journey thinking, what are these non-Jewish teachers going to know about the Holocaust? Why would they know anything? And I learned that they care deeply about it. It's personal to them. They want their students to learn from it. And he talked about how it transformed his understanding that it's not only a Jewish event. It's really a human catastrophe.
Well, that's profound. I had heard about it. Unfortunately, I was out of the city when they were in town, but that's wonderful.
Yeah.
I mean, the work you're doing is amazing. And it really is important. And I think you know this story. I'll share it with our folks. Is one of my proudest moments as a rabbi. One of our members, who no longer lives in Cincinnati, was rescued. I don't know if you remember this story. She was a child. She and her aunt were one of I think only about 5,000 Jews made it to Switzerland. Mm-hmm. They were two of those 5,000 rescued by their au pair, who was at the time 17 to 18 years old. Yeah. Who was in a cell of 30 people, 15 of whom were captured by the Nazis and killed by the Nazis. She eventually left the Netherlands, and she just had a tough time, but eventually came back. And she was recognized by the Dutch government as a war hero, but not by Israel. She had not been recognized. And when I heard the story, I was able to gather up materials, and Yad Vashem recognized her as a righteous among the nation, a non-Jewish person. And I was asked by the Israeli embassy in the Netherlands to represent American Jewry. Right. And I was sitting in a room, a synagogue in Rotterdam. She and another living rescuer were there, and 3 were being honored posthumously. And in the room, in the sanctuary, were the people they saved, their children, and the grandchildren. And it was one of the most extraordinary moments of my life to see what they did and how they did it, and to meet these 2 individuals in John. And for those of you who want, on ourjewishcommunity.org, some of the materials from there are posted, was the most unassuming person who, when asked why she did it, she said, "What else would I do?" Never thought of herself as a hero. That moniker that was not what she was. She just was simply a person. And keeping this alive, both the stories of those who survived, those who died, those who rescued, those who risked their lives, teaching the next generation and linking it is so profoundly important. So your work and the work of the center is really to be commended.
Thank you.
And I really appreciate the work you're doing, in Cincinnati, the work you do really globally ultimately, because it really, I think we don't know how these stories
Right.
Ripple out,
Right.
and the teachers you touch and how it transforms and what does it mean and the interlacing of this, because I think that notion that it is a world event and something that the world needs to remember is profoundly important.
Yeah.
So I appreciate you doing that.
Thank you. Thank
Appreciate you being a community sponsor partner when we bring Steen Metz in. I'm looking forward to that. I know it will be
too.
very interesting. It's a different story from we talk about Terezin,
Yeah.
which is a story that a lot of people don't know. They think about the concentration camps, but not the ghetto, and
Right.
not quite sure how those things fit together. So I think he'll be able to provide some very important information. So I'm delighted you were here,
Thank you.
and I want to thank you and appreciate your work.
Thank you.